Sometimes if there is difficulty with an intervention plan, we have to consider what might be going wrong. This is a list of items that I would always go through with my staff. First of all, an intervention needs to be comprehensive. In other words, it needs all the important parts, but it doesn't need to be more complex than it has to be. The more complex an intervention plan is, the more likely that it's going to be messed up. So what we always did with my students is we would look at our plans and we would look at ways we could simplify them. How could we accomplish the same thing with less time, with less paperwork? Students often had good ideas for how to simplify things. The staff folks, the paraprofessionals, also had very good ideas, and I tried to incorporate their changes into the plan. If your intervention isn't being consistently implemented, it's going to be difficult for it to be effective. If you're in a setting like a middle school and you're having problems with some teachers, let's say that kids are going to different class blocks, I always tried to begin interventions in settings where I knew they were most likely to be effective. I didn't try to implement something across the day in the beginning, but I would target a classroom where I thought I would get cooperation. I would try the intervention there. Then once it was successful, then I would take that to a grade level team and we would discuss implementation. I found that I was much more likely to get support if I had demonstrated that something could be effective for a student in the beginning. I had this experience in the spring. One of my students' teachers was working in a middle school. She developed a self-monitoring program for one of her students. She did not get a lot of support in the beginning. However, by the end of her student teaching, she had had one other teacher implement the program. My student teacher had implemented it herself. The student had made such significant improvements that by the end, all of that student's teachers wanted to be trained in how to implement that plan. Sometimes interventions are not effective because the reinforcers that we're trying to use are not adequate or they're simply ineffective. It's extremely important to look at the reinforcers for the problem behavior. What's maintaining the behavior? That is often a big clue for us as to what's going to work for this student. If a kid is doing things to get attention from peers, is there a way that you can use peer attention as a reinforcer? If the student is engaging in a behavior to escape work, can you use that as a reinforcer? Don't laugh, you can do it. I had a student in Utah who taught middle school kids with emotional and behavioral disorders. She came up with a system to reinforce students with little tokens. She called them dots. They were stickers. For completing one or two math problems, she would give them a dot. Once they earned the dot, they could put it on top of another program, and they didn't have to do it. What was interesting is these kids started doing more work than they'd ever done just to buy themselves out of doing a few problems. When she talked to me about this, I told her that I didn't think it would work, but it ended up working extremely well, and she's been using it ever since. Satiation is another reason that interventions might not work. If you use a reinforcer too often, then students are going to stop being motivated by it. That's why it's important to vary reinforcers, change them up. Also, use things like reinforcement menus. Give students choices. Point systems or token systems have safeguards for satiation built into them because you can change the types of reinforcers that students can select from to trade in their tokens. Another thing to consider is something called bootleg or competing reinforcers. A bootleg reinforcer is when someone makes a counterfeit reinforcement. For example, my student who was teaching the middle school kids, she was using the DOTS program for kids to buy themselves out of math. One day she came in and every kid had just this huge quantity of dots and they were all buying themselves out of half their work. She found that one of the kids had caught on to the fact that she was buying those little red dots at Office Max, and he just went and bought a box of them, and he was selling them to his friends. So she had to sign them all. So that's how she dealt with the bootleg reinforcement. Competing reinforcers deal with the fact that the problem behavior might still be reinforced. For example, if you've got a kid and he has a problem behavior maintained by peer attention, other kids are reinforcing that kid with attention. The reinforcer that he or she may be earning has to compete with that other reinforcer, the problem behavior. So the student's going to do the behavior that gets reinforced. So you might have to take some steps to reduce the reinforcement that peers get, or that peers are providing the student. We'll talk about group contingencies. That can be a good way sometimes to minimize attention from peers. Accidental reinforcement happens when you reinforce a problem behavior by mistake. For example, a person who's not familiar with a program could come into the classroom and reinforce a student. Or, sometimes it just happens. We forget or we make mistakes. If something like that happens, don't beat yourself up. It's very likely will happen sometimes. And fortunately, if it doesn't happen very often, it's not a huge problem. If it happens a lot, then you need to look at the source of the problem. Is it that you need to communicate more clearly with staff people? Does everyone need to be on board? My wife had a student who she would send on errands and things, and he would stop and get in conversations with people along the way. He was a really social kid, and people would stop and talk to him. She developed a reinforcement plan to reinforce him to go to the office and then come right back within a certain amount of time to earn a reinforcer. Well, what was happening is people were still talking to him along the way. So she had some competing reinforcers going on, and she also had some accidental reinforcement because people were reinforcing his stopping and lingering behavior. So she had to really work on communication so that everyone knew that he had a job and he was supposed to go there and come right back. If he tried to initiate some kind of contact with them, they were supposed to just say hello and keep going. Schedule strain is another issue with reinforcement programs. Remember I said to develop an effective reinforcement program, you start where the student is, and then you gradually increase what you expect from the student. That's called thinning a schedule of reinforcement, and that's a good thing to do. However, if you do it too quickly, you can see the behavior decrease. That means that you increase the requirement for reinforcement too quickly. That's called schedule strain. Another word is ratio strain. You'll see it written each way. If that happens, it means you just need to back up a little bit, maybe back up to where you were, and then when the student regains some of those gains, then increase the requirement more slowly. That's not a huge deal if that happens, but it is important to change things right away. Don't keep trying to use a schedule that's not working. Another problem with reinforcement programs is when plans are not implemented consistently. If you have people doing things differently or people simply not using the program, that is a problem. It's important to have very clear communication. I mentioned I had weekly meetings with my staff. We would come together at least once a week or so. That helps with communication. It helps with consistency. And finally, the target behavior changes sometimes. Sometimes we may start out with one issue, and then over time it changes. This happens sometimes when you have several behaviors that serve the same function. One behavior might be the biggest problem, so that might be the one that you target for intervention. When that behavior decreases, sometimes another behavior problem that happened only once in a while will increase. So sometimes we have to keep adapting our interventions as behavior change. So behavior plans are not things that you develop and then just continue to do. They require constant monitoring and constant changing. That's just the way it is. What are some of the ways that you actually determine what a reinforcer is going to be? Well, my favorite way is to use functional behavior assessment information. I like to look at the reinforcers for the problem behavior and I like to look at ways I can use that reinforcer to increase appropriate behavior. Other things you can do if you've got students who are verbal and students who can, provide useful information, talk to them about it. Ask them what they would like to work for. Talk to people who have worked with that student in the past. Sometimes that's not the best way. Even if some kids are verbal, they're not sometimes good at telling you what might be effective for them. Watch students. Watch what things they choose to do. How do they spend their time when they're given choices? And watch for when they have problem behavior. What seems to be the reinforcers for those behaviors as well. Some more formal ways of determining reinforcers to do something called reinforcement sampling. You simply give access to different things that you might use as reinforcers, and you watch, what the students prefer. You can give things one at a time, or sometimes, again, my favorite way is I would do comparisons. I would say when you finish, you can work for this or you can work for that. What do you want to work for? And I looked at how students chose things. This is simplified if you can do something like a menu. If you can give students some choices to begin with. Not only does that make it more likely you're going to have a reinforcer that's going to be effective, but it also prevents satiation. Context is important when you consider reinforcers. Things like praise, food, money, a preferred activity, those are all potential reinforcers, but if under some conditions those may not be reinforcers. Obviously, if you're using food as a reinforcer, if someone's, I really like peanut M&Ms, and unfortunately for me sometimes, but even me, if I had just eaten a 2-pound bag and you asked me to do something and you said, hey Woody, when you finish this I'll give you this little cup of M&Ms. If I've just eaten a 2-pound bag, that's probably not going to look real appealing for me. Praise is a good reinforcer if the student values your praise. What I often tell people, if you're going to use praise and you're going to use positive feedback as a reinforcer, you have to establish yourself as a source of reinforcement. Do you have the kind of relationship with your student that she or he cares what you say? Also, if you don't change it around and sound genuine, it's going to become really monotonous and it's going to stop being reinforcing in itself. So you have to look at the context of reinforcers, whether or not this is something that where satiation has occurred, and you have to be flexible when you develop reinforcement programs. What are your options? If you're using something to reinforcer and it no longer is reinforcing, what can you do? And this is when you have satiation. It's too much of a good thing is not so good. And doing things like reinforcement menus or varying reinforcers are effective ways for dealing with satiation. We already talked about bootleg and competing reinforcers. These are, either the kid comes up with counterfeit tokens or other sources of reinforcement are there. You have to design your system so that they can't be counterfeited, obviously. Sometimes that can be a little tricky if you have real sophisticated kids. I had a friend who worked in a juvenile program for juvenile offenders, and those kids were always coming up with ingenious ways to counterfeit his reinforcement programs, and he had to come up with more and more elaborate things to do to prevent that from happening. I think he actually enjoyed it. He kept him on his toes, he said.